In this video, we're going to continue our discussion of the evolution of the Spanish language from Latin, detailing how the Spanish tonic vowel system came into being. This discussion follows closely section 2.4 of the book, A History of the Spanish Language by Ralph Penny. Let's take a moment to address an important issue that often arises in our discussions about the evolution of Latin into the Romance languages. We often hear questions about the specific dates and periods during which certain linguistic changes occurred, and it's a valid curiosity. We naturally like clear boundaries and well-defined timelines. However, it's essential to remember that linguistic transformations didn't happen overnight, or even within the span of a few years. They were slow, gradual processes that unfolded over centuries. Moreover, these changes were not uniform across the vast expanse of the Roman Empire. Depending on the strata of society or the geographical region, older linguistic forms could and did coexist with newer ones for considerable periods. Therefore, any attempt to pin down specific dates for these transitions risks oversimplification that may lead to an inaccurate understanding of this process. So in this video, instead of trying to divide the history into discrete and well-defined periods, I'll use more general terms like early Latin, later Latin, early Spanish, and later Spanish, acknowledging the gradual and overlapping nature of the process. While this approach is less definitive, it gives a more accurate and nuanced understanding of the reality. Overview of the Latin vowel system. Let's begin our discussion with the early Latin vowel system. In writing, Latin had 5 letters representing vowel sounds. With regard to pronunciation, each of the 5 letters represented 2 similar sounds, the main difference being duration. So for each of the vowels there was a short phoneme and a long phoneme. Now long vowels are often pronounced slightly higher in the mouth than their shorter equivalents. This was true of Latin, as it is of many modern languages, and the consequence was that the 10 simple vowels of early Latin can be seen to have the following allophones, with the short vowels having different aperture from the long vowels, as well as having shorter duration. The exception is the low center vowel, which had the same aperture in both allophones. Modern scholars of Latin distinguish between long and short vowels by placing macrons or microns over them. In these videos, I'll normally only use macrons when spelling out words. So Latin vowels with no symbol over them can be assumed to be short. Just realize that Romans didn't use macrons or microns when they wrote. Also, please understand that this has nothing to do with English long and short vowels. That's a completely different thing. Now, vowel length wasn't just a flourish or embellishment of Latin pronunciation. It was phonemic, which means it resulted in differences in meaning, as demonstrated by pairs of words with only vowel length as a differentiator. Here are some examples. While the 10-vowel system existed in older Latin and persisted in the higher social registers of formal spoken Latin, over time, changes occurred in popular spoken Latin. The most notable change, which happened no later than the 1st century AD, was the shift in emphasis from vowel length to vowel aperture. In other words, vowel distinction started to rely more on the articulation of the sound rather than its duration. The exact reason for this shift isn't unanimously agreed upon among linguists. What's clear is that the previously insignificant aperture differences began to play more of a role, becoming the main way to distinguish vowels of the same class. This led to the merger of long A and short A, which had no difference in aperture, reducing the Latin vowel system to the following 9 phonemes. This shift is exemplified in word pairs such as this. Initially, they were distinguished mostly by vowel length, but later became distinguished by aperture. The next significant transformations of the Latin vowel system were closely tied to stress. You see, the vowels of Latin evolved differently depending on whether they were in stressed or unstressed syllables, with stressed vowels differentiating from one another more dramatically, and unstressed vowels differentiating less so, and even merging. In order to make sense of these changes, we'll need to talk about stressed and unstressed vowels separately. In this discussion, we'll refer to stressed vowels as tonic, and unstressed vowels as atonic. The Vulgar Latin vowel system. The 9-vowel system was inherently unstable. It's quite challenging to maintain a system with 5 distinct degrees of aperture, since the acoustic difference between the vowels can become too subtle to reliably distinguish. This instability led to a significant shift around the 1st century AD. Tongue heights 3 and 4 merged, simplifying the system to 7 vowels. This 7-tonic vowel system, commonly referred to as the Vulgar Latin vowel system, was used across the Latin-speaking world, including Spain. Alright, so short I and long E combined to give closed E, while short U and long O merged into closed O. As you can imagine, this led to a degree of spelling confusion among ordinary Roman citizens who wrote phonetically and were not educated in classical Latin. In the graffiti of Pompeii, for instance, we find misspellings like these, where the writer used E instead of the classical Latin I. And in the Appendix Probi, the author corrects common spelling errors where O is used for U and vice versa. Metaphany. During the Vulgar Latin phase, stressed vowels underwent metaphany, also known as vowel harmony, a phonological process wherein the articulation of a vowel is influenced by a following vowel. In the case of Vulgar Latin, this meant raising a vowel a step, or sometimes 2 steps, when it preceded the high vowel E, or glide Y. Obviously, E and U, which were already the highest vowels, were not affected by this process. Now, metaphany is quite complex, with many rules describing whether a vowel is raised or not, depending on the exact phonetic context. I encourage interested viewers to investigate the topic more in depth. Before looking at examples of metaphany, a few caveats. I don't claim to be an expert in the pronunciation of classical or vulgar Latin or even Old Spanish, so expect my pronunciation of any example words in this video to have a heavy modern Spanish accent. Please understand that the initial word in each sentence isn't necessarily classical Latin, but some version of early spoken Latin. Apart from metaphany, many of the examples have other phonological processes going on. I'll name those processes and point them out, but I won't try to explain them in detail. Alright, with that, let's look at some examples. Closed E raising to I. These examples are some of the most straightforward and easiest to appreciate. Observe that this intermediate stage of this word has this E sound in this syllable and this Y sound in the following syllable. Metaphany causes the E to be raised to E in this later version. So, vendemia becomes vendimia. Similarly, this intermediate stage has this E in the syllable preceding this Y. Again, metaphany causes the E to raise to E, so betrio becomes vidrio. Same situation here with limpio becoming limpio. O raising to U. In these examples, keep in mind that through the vowel mergers we described earlier, these short U's were pronounced as O. So the O sound preceding Y in this intermediate stage came to be pronounced as U. Robio became rubio. Same situation here. Plovia became lluvia. And here, torbio became turbio for the same reason. A absorbs I and raises to closed E. Most of the examples here first underwent a process of metathesis, where the glide of one diphthong became the semivowel of the preceding diphthong. So in this example, we first have metathesis, then metaphany, as the A absorbs E and raises to A. So basio became baiso, and then beso. Same thing here with aria becoming aira, and then era. Here sapia became saipa, and then sepa. This one's a bit different. First, the K sound was vocalized to E. So lacte to laite, and then leche. And in this case, the intervening V was lost, resulting in the diphthong. So cantawi to cantai to cante. Open E absorbs I and raises to closed E. These examples are very similar to the ones above. Here the word undergoes metathesis from materia to matera, and then metaphany from matera to madera. Same situation here, queresia becomes queresa, and eventually cereza. Here the K vocalizes to E, so directo becomes derecho, and then derecho. K also vocalizes in this example, with lecto becoming leito, and then metaphany to lecho. Here the G vocalizes to E, so integro becomes entero, and then entero. Open O absorbs I and raises to closed O. In this example, K vocalizes to E, and then this open O absorbs E and raises to closed O. Octo to oito to ocho. Same situation here with nocte becoming noite and then noche. Closed O absorbs I and raises to U. Here the K vocalizes, with lokta becoming loita, and then the O absorbing the E and raising to lucha. Same situation here with trokta becoming troita and then trucha. Here ul vocalizes to U, with molto becoming molto. Then U fronts to E and finally gets absorbed. Molto to moito and eventually mucho. And in this example, ul vocalizes to U and then fronts to E. And then O absorbs E and raises to U. So, empolsat becomes emposat, and then empoisat, and eventually empuja. Diphthongization. In the late Roman period, the stressed vowels of many regional dialects of Latin around the empire underwent further modification, various Iberian dialects among them. There are several competing ideas about how and why this happened, but none is universally accepted. One theory is that Latin was influenced by Germanic languages during the centuries when Germanic tribes such as the Visigoths entered Roman lands. Regardless of the reason, the articulation of affected vowels changed and the acoustic difference between them and neighboring vowel sounds decreased, giving rise to potential confusion. For example, this word and this word came to be nearly indistinguishable. In order to resolve the potential confusion, some varieties of Romance, including Castilian, underwent a process wherein these vowels became these diphthongs when in a stressed syllable. This process affected the pronunciation of literally thousands of words, and there's no way I could discuss them all here. But here are a few examples. Observe that as openi becomes ie, bene becomes bien, and petra becomes piedra. And as openo becomes ue, bonus becomes bueno, and osum becomes hueso. With regard to the inventory of Spanish vowel phonemes, since 2 of the 7 Vulgar Latin tonic vowels turned into diphthongs, and the diphthongs were comprised of 2 of the other vowels in the system, the number of tonic vowel phonemes in Spanish was reduced to 5. Stem change verbs. One interesting consequence of the 2 processes we've described in this video, metaphany and diphthongization, is the emergence of Spanish stem change verbs. In my next video, I'll talk about the ins and outs of the unstressed or atonic vowels, but for now it's sufficient to say that in unstressed syllables, the 10 Latin vowels reduced to 5 Spanish vowels like this. As you can see, the big difference in outcome between the stressed and unstressed system is these diphthongs that arose from these vowel phonemes in the stressed vowels. One feature of Spanish verb conjugation is that in some forms of the verb, the stress falls on the stem, while in other conjugations it falls on a syllable in the verb ending. Combining this fact with what we've learned about the diphthongization of certain vowel phonemes, we get the pattern of E to IE and O to UE stem-changing verbs we're all familiar with. Let's take a look at one example each of E to IE and O to UE stem changes. In this Latin verb, this E was a short E. In the Vulgar Latin vowel system, it therefore became an open E. In the transition to Spanish, open E became the diphthong IE when stressed and the simple vowel E when unstressed. In the conjugated forms of the Spanish verb, the stress falls on that syllable in these 4 forms, so the open E follows the pattern of stressed vowels and becomes the IE diphthong. But the stress falls on a syllable in the verb ending in the infinitive and these 2 conjugations, so the open E follows the pattern of unstressed vowels and becomes E. This difference in the fate of Latin short E, depending on whether it was stressed or unstressed, explains the pattern we see in which verb conjugations have the stem change and which ones don't. In this Latin verb, this O was a short O. In the Vulgar Latin vowel system, it therefore became an open O. In the transition to Spanish, open O became the diphthong UE when stressed and the simple vowel O when unstressed. In the conjugated forms of the Spanish verb, the stress falls on that syllable in these 4 forms, so the open O follows the pattern of stressed vowels and becomes the UE diphthong. But the stress falls on a syllable in the verb ending in the infinitive in these 2 conjugations, so the open O follows the pattern of unstressed vowels and becomes O. This difference in the fate of Latin short O, depending on whether it was stressed or unstressed, explains the pattern we see in which verb conjugations have the stem change and which ones don't. Now this explanation is a bit simplified. While this is the root of this phenomenon, some diphthong stem change verbs came about by analogy with verbs like perder and volver, and not because they had a short E or O in the original Latin form. So this isn't a complete discussion of this phenomenon. Still, this is the basic idea. Now, the E to I stem change is a bit different. It's the result of a combination of metaphony in some verb forms and analogy, applying that metaphonic vowel change to other verb forms as a way of regularizing the system. And the pattern of metaphony isn't quite the same as we discussed earlier in this video. There's actually a lot going on with E to I stem changes, and it's more complicated than I want to get into right now. Still, the principles are broadly similar, and one of them is that metaphony generally applies to stressed syllables. A regularization of that principle in the present tense is why the E to I stem change is seen in these conjugations and not these. Alright, this has been our discussion of the evolution of the Spanish tonic vowel system. My next video will talk about the evolution of the Spanish atonic vowel system, as well as some other topics regarding vowels if time permits.